Cry. File for a divorce. Start an affair. Separate. These are common reactions to a cheating wife. But what happens when a scorned husband decides to hurt a mother in the worst ways imaginable? To hurt a child that even he swore to protect. In today's episode, we're examining a heartbreaking case that reveals how betrayal and unchecked anger can shatter lives. This is the story of a man whose jealousy over his wife's infidelity led him to commit an unspeakable act against someone who should have been under his protection. The victim? His own stepdaughter, a young girl whose trust was cruelly violated. This tragic story is not just about a heinous crime, it's about the devastating effects of one person's choices, the strength of a survivor, and the importance of seeking help for unresolved pain before it spirals out of control. But what really happened before Greg became a prisoner? What happened before the rest of his life was thrown away? At the center of this story is Greg Young, a 42-year-old truck driver who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood with his wife, Elaine, and her 13-year-old daughter, Chloe, from a previous marriage. To outsiders, they seemed like an average family. Greg was known as a hardworking stepfather, Elaine was active in the community, and Chloe was a bright, cheerful girl who loved school and spending time with her friends. But behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Elaine was struggling to pay the bills and Greg had little or nothing to do to support her. He'd just lost his job at the factory where he was a driver and their finances had taken a downward spiral after then. For Elaine, she had a duty to support her daughter and her husband who had been nothing but supportive since they got married. This was a burden that Elaine had to bear dutifully. And that is when she found an easy way out. There was a wealthy man across the street. Victor McLean, a banker and stockbroker who had a thing for overpriced cars and perfumes. He had just moved in shortly after the Youngs moved in. It was a quiet neighborhood and not somewhere Victor looked comfortable in, but his wife, Melissa Ivor, was a seasoned professor and she liked the quiet country life, and so, they had moved. Both families weren't close. But they were right across the street and Victor always needed help with his tire or his sink and Greg was quite handy, so he always stepped in to help. It was on one of those days that Victor came to find Greg that something happened. Elaine was right there in the kitchen, wearing nothing but a sheer negligee, and she thought she was alone. Victor had apologized profusely for barging in on her and said he'd been knocking for a while. But Elaine was so absorbed in her worries about their piling bills and eviction notice that she'd barely taken note. Victor, a married man and father of two, could imagine what stress the young lady was going through. He sympathized with her and in the spur of the moment promised to clear out the light and water bill for the next few months. Elaine was thankful and promised to refund as soon as she could. But she knew Victor was a proud man, and so they made a pact not to let Victor know until he could pay back. What started out as a friendly neighbor offering help soon turned into infidelity. It wasn't just light and water bill payment they were hiding from Victor, it was everything that happened in exotic hotels within and outside the city and the few quickies that even took place in Victor's small home. But with such brazen betrayal, how long could they hide? With their spouses right under their nose, how long could they play the cat and mouse game? Not long. Not long. One rainy evening, Greg returned home earlier than expected from a long work trip. It was another failed gig and he was frustrated. He headed home much earlier than expected. When he arrived, he noticed Elaine's car was missing. Suspicious, he entered the house and realized something wasn't right. Greg glanced out the window and saw Elaine through Victor's window, embracing him. But this wasn't when it all started. This was merely a thought. A seed of doubt planted in his head. Why was she in the neighbor's house and why was she hugging him? Greg wasn't a man of many words. In fact, he wasn't a man of words. As the court would later discover, he didn't take no for an answer and he'd met Elaine under the most unlikely circumstances after fighting off an attacker at the train station. It seemed like Elaine had met her hero, but little did she know that the same hands that hurt her attacker would one day hurt her too. At the age of 15, Greg was sent to juvenile prison for attacking and raping his mother. It was an act of anger and the mother didn't want to press charges. But his father and brother did, and when Greg got out, he was estranged from his family and made life on his own. Throughout his adult life, Greg struggled with feelings of inadequacy and a desperate need for control. But then he met Elaine. A quiet and loving woman. And everything changed. Or so he thought. Now, many years after he'd thought, he believed that he left his demons behind, he was faced with his worst nightmare. Losing control. The discovery of Elaine's affair shattered his fragile sense of self, and instead of addressing his emotions constructively, he took revenge in the worst way imaginable. Psychologists speculated that Greg's crime was not just an act of anger but also a twisted attempt to regain power in a situation where he felt completely powerless. Victor was still obsessed with taking what he wanted. And after the betrayal, he decided that Chloe, his 12-year-old stepdaughter, was what he wanted. Elaine had become careless with her affair. Victor was providing for her family, and although Victor had gotten a new job, Elaine was already used to the luxury of living like the mistress of a wealthy man. Greg was concerned about their sudden rise in finances. But Elaine had the perfect lie. Her grandaunt had willed her some money and it just so happened that she'd recently passed away. Although he felt less than a man because Elaine had to help out, he was comforted that it was from a late relative. But Greg would come to find out that this was nothing but a lie and his wife had been betraying him for the past 3 years. On the night of Greg and Elaine's anniversary, Greg returned home late after a long day of work. He had planned to surprise his wife with flowers and a heartfelt note, hoping to rekindle the spark that had been dimmed by his recent late nights at work. But as he walked into their home, something felt off. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet for a night that should have been filled with celebration. As Greg stepped into the living room, he noticed the faint but unmistakable scent of cologne lingering in the air. It wasn't his own, and it wasn't a fragrance he recognized as Elaine's. The scent was distinct, masculine, and luxurious. At first, Greg tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Elaine had bought a new air freshener, or maybe a visitor had stopped by earlier in the day. But as he made his way to their bedroom, his doubts grew stronger. The cologne seemed to grow more potent, clinging to the air like a ghost of someone who shouldn't have been there. Elaine wasn't home. The anniversary dinner she'd promised to prepare was nowhere in sight. Her phone was off, and there was no note explaining her absence. Greg sat alone in the dimly lit living room, his mind racing with possibilities. And as much as he tried to push the thought aside, one question loomed larger than the rest: was Elaine cheating on him? Was she with Victor? His car was clearly not in his front yard and that luxurious cologne was definitely his. He'd smelt it before while working on his car during a casual conversation. Greg had complimented the man on his cologne. Victor had chuckled and explained that it was a rare, expensive brand he'd purchased during a business trip abroad. Greg even recalled Victor jokingly offering to get him a bottle someday. It was a woodsy scent. A brand he'd never used himself. Something way above his pay grade. Later that night, Elaine returned with some excuse about having to see her sister. Greg had called earlier. Elaine's sister wasn't in town. It was clearly a lie. Over the next 2 days, Greg couldn't shake the memory of that cologne. It clung to his thoughts like a thorn, a painful reminder of his growing suspicions. This was when Greg knew he had to find out more. Victor, the charming and successful banker, lived just a few houses away with his wife and 3 children. He was the kind of man who seemed to have it all: wealth, status, and an air of confidence that made him the center of attention at neighborhood gatherings. The next day, Greg decided to test his theory. He paid a visit to Victor, framing it as a friendly neighborly drop-by. They exchanged pleasantries, and as they talked, Greg casually brought up the cologne again. "That cologne of yours, Victor, it's incredible. I've been thinking about getting a bottle for myself. What's it called again?" Victor smiled, clearly flattered by the compliment. "Ah, it's a French brand, very exclusive. You know, if you want, I can get you one. I still have a bottle or 2 at home." Greg feigned enthusiasm, thanking Victor for the offer. True to his word, Victor excused himself and returned moments later with a sleek, elegant bottle of cologne. When Greg got home, he immediately uncapped the bottle and took a whiff. The scent was unmistakable. It was the same cologne he'd smelled in his home on the night of their anniversary. His suspicions were no longer just suspicions, they were a painful, undeniable truth. But Greg wasn't ready to confront Elaine. Not yet. He needed proof. He needed proof for the revenge he had in mind. He needed some sort of justification for the sinister plan he had. That evening, while Elaine was out, Greg installed a small hidden camera in their bedroom. He placed it carefully behind their wedding portrait, ensuring it was out of sight but perfectly positioned to capture everything. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and anger as Greg waited for the footage to confirm what he already knew in his heart. And then, it happened. Late one evening, while Greg pretended to be out of town for work, the camera recorded everything. Elaine and Victor, together in the very bed Greg still shared with his wife. The betrayal was devastating, but Greg's response wasn't immediate rage. Instead, he felt a cold vengeance within his soul. He transferred the footage to his computer and watched it repeatedly, each time feeling his resolve harden. He wasn't just going to confront Elaine, he was going to make Victor pay. The following day, Greg approached Victor with the evidence. He cornered the banker in his office, presenting the footage on a tablet. Victor was visibly shaken. He tried to reason with Daniel, offering apologies and excuses, but Greg wasn't interested in words. He demanded a substantial sum of money in exchange for his silence. $500,000. Reluctantly, Victor agreed, transferring the funds to Greg that same day. But the money wasn't enough to quell Victor's growing resentment. A few days later, he returned to Victor with another demand for more money, threatening to release the footage if Victor didn't comply. This time, Victor hesitated. He refused and Greg went back home. But little did he know that Greg had ideas in mind. Victor's wife wasn't a very forgiving person and Victor knew that a divorce would rob him dry. Greg threatened him to never mention their encounter to his wife. Elaine was kept in the dark. For the next few weeks, Elaine was broken. Victor hadn't reached out to her. They began to grow apart and Elaine lied that she was stressed. Victor noticed her gloomy mood and he was secretly pleased. Unbeknownst to Victor and Elaine, Greg had been meticulously planning his next move. He didn't just want to expose the affair, he wanted to completely destroy the lives of the people who had betrayed him. And with each passing day, his plan grew darker and more sinister. What happens next will leave you questioning the limits of betrayal and the lengths people will go to when pushed to the brink. For years, Greg had poured his heart and soul into loving Elaine and her daughter, Chloe, as his own. Though Chloe wasn't biologically his, he had always treated her like she was. But now, with the knowledge of Elaine's betrayal, his love for Chloe had become tainted. Every time he looked at her, he saw Elaine's lies. And in his fractured mind, Chloe had become a symbol of the deceit that destroyed him. Victor's descent into darkness was no longer just about revenge, it was about control, about making Elaine suffer the way he believed she'd made him suffer. He could no longer stomach the thought of Elaine getting away unscathed, living a happy life while he drowned in his pain. And so, he devised a plan, one that he believed would hurt Elaine where it mattered most, Chloe. One morning, while packing Chloe's lunch for school, Greg laced her juice with a fast-acting poison, nothing deadly, just enough to make her sick. It wasn't enough for him to simply hurt Elaine physically, he wanted to dismantle her emotionally, to make her question everything she held dear. The call came just a few hours later. The school nurse informed Greg that Chloe had collapsed during recess and had been taken to the school clinic. As Elaine was unreachable, Greg was the first contact, and he rushed to the school to pick Chloe up. On the drive home, Greg glanced at Chloe in the rearview mirror. Her small frame seemed even smaller as she lay slumped in the back seat, pale and weak. Her skirt had ridden up slightly, revealing her bruised knees. Chloe had been innocent in all this. She was just a child, caught in the crossfire of her mother's betrayal. Yet, in that moment, Greg convinced himself that she was a necessary pawn in his plan. How else could he make Elaine feel the same pain he'd felt? Greg pulled into their driveway and carried Chloe into the house. He laid her down on the couch. But he wasn't going to defile her alone. No. He needed Victor to be there. Calling Victor, he ordered him home from work, still blackmailing him with his sex tape. Victor was helpless. Under this threat, Greg forced Victor to take advantage of Chloe over and over again in her unconscious state, and he took videos of it. A few days later, Greg laced Chloe's drink for the second time. This time, he thought he had perfected the method. He added a sedative to her juice, confident it would knock her out completely during her afternoon nap. What Greg didn't know was that Chloe had become deeply suspicious of him after her last experience. She remembered how sick she'd felt after her lunch a few days earlier, and though she couldn't fully articulate why, she had begun to associate the feeling with anything Greg gave her. Her young mind couldn't process the full extent of what was happening, but instinctively, she had started avoiding the food and drinks he prepared for her. When Greg brought her the juice that day, Chloe thanked him but quietly set it aside. She didn't drink a single sip, even though she felt tired and weak. Instead, she pretended to be asleep, hoping that Greg would leave her alone. As he crept into Chloe's room minutes later, he believed she was unconscious from the sedative. What he didn't realize was that Chloe was fully awake, her small body tense with fear as she lay under the blanket, her heart racing. When Greg leaned over her, pulling her skirt up after setting up the camera, Chloe couldn't keep up the act any longer. She bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. "What are you doing?" she cried, her voice trembling. Greg froze, panic flashing across his face, and then he tried to strangle her. Chloe wasn't strong, but she was fast and she fought him off skillfully. She banged on Victor's door and his wife opened up. Chloe was distraught, frightened, and she needed help. Between sobs, Chloe explained what had just happened. Though her words were fragmented and emotional, Victor's wife quickly pieced together the horrifying truth. She didn't hesitate, she called the police immediately, followed by Elaine. When the authorities arrived, Greg was still at home. He tried to deny everything, painting himself as a concerned stepfather who had been misunderstood. He presented the evidence of Victor raping Chloe and almost changed the whole story. But it was time for Victor to finally confess. As the investigation unfolded, more horrifying details came to light. Victor's actions hadn't been isolated incidents, they were part of a plan to punish Elaine for her infidelity and to replace her, in a twisted sense, with Chloe who he believed was pure. Victor, too, was pulled into the case. Initially, he denied any involvement, but under the pressure of evidence and questioning, he broke down. He revealed how Greg had blackmailed him with the affair and forced him to comply with his demands. Though Victor was guilty of his own sins, including his relationship with Elaine and his failure to report Victor's earlier behavior, he became a key witness in the case. In court, evidence from hidden cameras, testimonies from Chloe, Elaine, and Victor's own manipulative actions painted a clear picture of a man consumed by rage and desperation. Victor, however, refused to take full responsibility. "I was a broken man," he told the court during his sentencing. "I loved my family, and I just wanted to save it. Elaine is the traitor. Not me." Victor lost his wife. Elaine lost her affair and Elaine lost her stepfather, and a family was crushed by the greed of wife and the bitterness and wounds of a man who never healed. The scars left by Daniel's actions ran deep. Chloe, though alive, was forever changed. She spent years in therapy, grappling with the trauma of betrayal and the loss of her sense of safety. How does a child recover from discovering that the man she called Dad was her greatest danger? So next time you ask, what does it take to break a man? What does it take to uncover years of darkness and wickedness lurked behind the exterior of a living husband? You have your answer. Revenge.